So thank you so much for joining us tonight for the third edition of Writer's Block. I'm Jayo. I'm board member of the Korean American Story, whose mission is to capture, create, preserve, and share the stories of Korean American experience. Writer's Block is our virtual community event where you can personally engage with Korean American authors live. This program is made possible by our monthly Storyteller Circle donors, and we would like to thank them for their generosity. And you can join the Storyteller Circle too. This month, my fellow board member, Karen Kim, is offering to double your donation when you join the Storyteller Circle. Your $10 a month donation can become $20 a month if you join now. The end of the month is just around the corner, so please join now to take advantage of this generous offer. Please text Storytellers to 44321 or visit our website, koreanamericanstory.org. And now I am thrilled to welcome our guest for this edition of Writer's Block, Nicole Chung, the author of the national bestseller, All You Can Ever Know, which was named the best book of the year by the Washington Post, NPR, Library Journal, and many other outlets. Chung's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Time, The Guardian, and The Vulture, among others. And she also writes a weekly advice column for Slate. So Nicole, it's great to see you. Welcome to the Writer's Block and the Korean American Story.
Thank you so much, Jay, and thank you all for being here. I'm really thrilled.
So we're going to start talking a little bit about the book. And as Deb mentioned, there will be a time for you guys to ask questions to Nicole directly. So I want to, because we usually talk about your life and then the book, but since you wrote a memoir and your book is about your life, so we're going to kind of combine the two together. In your book, you mentioned that you always knew that you were adopted. So what was the story that was told to you? And the fact that your birth family were Koreans, were they always part of that story?
Yes, even before I really had a clear understanding of my birth family situation, it would be decades before I really had a handle on that story. The story I was told growing up always included the fact they were Koreans, they were immigrants, they'd come to this country just a year or two before I was born. So I'm the first in my Korean family, I'm the first person born on American soil. And that they ran a small business in the Seattle area. And so part of the story was they worked very, very long hours. And when I was born severely prematurely, the doctors told them that I would have a whole host of health problems. And they thought that adoption was the best choice to give me, like, this is a direct quote, like a better life. That's what I was always told, is they made this sacrifice so you could have this better life. And it was like a nice story. It was, I think, told in part to be comforting. And it's not that it was false. I mean, there are elements of that I later found were true, but it was obviously a very simple story with a lot of holes. And, in the unquestioning way of childhood, I didn't really start to wonder how much more there was until I grew older and could really think about, okay, where did we get this information from? It was a closed adoption. So how could they know these things? And really start to question that origin story.
But when you were little and you weren't quite questioning the origin story per se, so what did it mean something to you that your birth parents were Koreans? Obviously, your parents were not Koreans, they were white. What did it mean to you that your birth family were Koreans? Did that give you any sense of identity? Did that give you any picture of what that meant?
It was so hard to have a clear picture. I admit, when I thought about them being Korean, I thought how comforting it would be to be around other Koreans. Like, if I could know them, what would it be like to actually have people in my life who looked like me? Because I grew up very loved, but in a white family and a very white community. So I honestly didn't even get to meet or know any other Koreans or become close to any until much, much later in life. It wouldn't be till I left home. And at the same time, that was the default for me. So it was actually, I didn't necessarily stop to question all the time. I would say I was constantly aware of the fact that I was Korean and the fact that this made me different from the people that I saw, and that somewhere out there I had this mysterious Korean family that I couldn't really begin to imagine yet. But like, even in terms of longing for a connection or to meet other Koreans, like, I think when you're a child, it's just very hard to question what you're raised with. And it's scary. It's scary to do that. And to sort of go down that rabbit hole of like all the things you don't have, all the connections that you might be missing. Honestly, it could be very painful sometimes when I thought about that, and not having any like real life mirrors and being separated from my Korean family. So, I mean, sometimes I admit it was something I didn't want to think about, even though in another sense, I was also constantly aware.
And you grew up in a very small town in Oregon, which was virtually white, not many minorities. In your book, you do discuss the moments of when you find that one Asian face and you really wanted to become friends with that kid and all that. Do you think, I mean, it's all in hindsight, obviously. Do you think things would have been slightly different if you grew up in a more urban, diverse area? Like, how you thought about your identity, would that have affected how you viewed yourself and your race? If you were as you said, surrounded by more familiar faces?
I think it would have had to have an impact. And of course, it's also really hard to speak about something that didn't occur, but it's like to speculate. It was something I thought about, and I thought about it a lot more after this trip that my family took back to Seattle, which is where my Korean parents had moved to and where I was born and adopted. My parents, my white parents, they still had family friends there. And we went to visit them once when I was about 10. And we went to the Chinatown International District. And I remember it was the first time in my life I had been entirely surrounded by Asians. Like, I could not stop staring at people. And every time we passed an Asian woman around my mother's age, I remember wondering, like, is this my mother? Like, it was just this powerful, visceral reaction. And I found it so comforting, like so deeply comforting in ways I didn't really even have language for because I was still a kid. And, for years after that trip, I would think about it, like I would remember it, and that feeling of, these were strangers to me. There was no reason actually that it should have felt so comforting or so safe, but I still remembered like that trip and that day in particular, when like it was actually my white parents who were in the minority, when we went to the big grocery store, when we went out to eat and we're walking around the international district, like everyone looked like me. And it was a deeply like important moment. And it got me starting to think, like, there are places not necessarily far off in Korea, but like here in the US even, where I could go and I could be another face in the crowd, or I could find more people like me, perhaps. And it was just kind of an important thing to like remember and sort of hope for, so that one day when I did have more control over like my environment and where I lived, like, I mean, I could think about being in a space where there would be more moments like that.
Mm. One of the most striking thing about your book was, you obviously had a very loving parents, your adoptee parents, but your sort of struggle with their idea of colorblindness. Whenever you ask the question about, anything that's related to, or you couldn't even really quite discuss certain things that you had to deal with because you were, normally the one and only. And, sometimes children can be incredibly brutal to each other. This idea, and their answer always was that, well, it doesn't matter to us. And it shouldn't matter to anybody else. But yet, in a sense, it mattered to you. Can you tell us a little bit about that attitude in the transracial adoptions? And I'm always also mentioning, because for non-adoptees like me, a lot of the adoptees narrative comes from the perspective of the adoptive parents, or especially if it's transracial adoptions, about how loving, really the adoptive parents trying to love this child no matter what, and things like that. So can you tell me a little bit about sort of that, not a clash, but how is it sort of that discrepancy a little bit in the attitude towards, colorblindness when it's, when you had to struggle with it, and your parents' sort of way of dealing with it was that, oh, it shouldn't matter?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think part of it was the era in which they adopted. I will say as recently as like 5, 10 years ago, I mean, and really, I get a lot of like, I often have adoptive families reaching out to me. I've definitely still heard from some adoptive parents, and I know they're well-meaning, and I don't question their love for their kids, but I've heard them say things like, race just really isn't relevant to my child or their experience. And sometimes they'll say it's because we live in a diverse area or something. And I'm kind of like, well, even if you do, like, of course, it's still relevant to their experience. But at the time, especially at the time I was adopted, my adoptive parents, they had to go through a home study. They had to work with an adoption agency. They worked with an adoption attorney, a social worker in Seattle, and an adoption judge at the family court. And so they had these multiple instances where they came across people who they really viewed as experts in adoption, because these people dealt with adoption all the time. And they always asked specifically about my race. And they said, does it matter that she's Korean and we're not? Is there something we should do? Is there something we should know? And every single person they asked at this point said no. And we're almost surprised that my parents even asked. My mother has hilariously said, I thought someone would at least recommend a book, but no one really did. And the judge told them, just assimilate her into your family and you'll be fine. That was actually the word he used, was assimilate, which my parents never forgot. And so I think in my upbringing, especially when I was younger, before I was old enough to begin talking and questioning and explaining to them about racism I had experienced, and the fact that race was very much relevant to how my life. I think that especially when I was younger, a lot of this quote unquote colorblind attitude came honestly from the people they consulted. I think they thought they were doing what they were supposed to. And they did honestly really think, and this was something they sort of, I think it was something they kind of struggled with all their lives, was seeing me as a Korean American. And then because it was so much, the message was so much well, you're just our daughter, and we love you, and it doesn't matter to us what race you are. And so, yeah, it shouldn't matter to anyone else. But of course it mattered to me. It had a real impact on my experience growing up, and still has an impact on my experience in the world. And I think over time, as I got older, we were able to have more conversations that, if we weren't on the exact same page, certainly brought us closer. But what ended up happening was that I had to do a lot of that work on my own, figuring out what was my racial identity, what did it mean? How was I Korean if I grew up apart from other Koreans? Was I less legitimate as a Korean? I had to do that really on my own without guidance. And then I was the one going to my white family and sort of taking on this extra role of educator. And so that was, which was done out of love. I wanted to try and bridge any gap that was perceived between us, but it wasn't always easy. And I think it is really hard when you haven't experienced racism in this country to really fully understand the experiences of someone who has, especially when their race is not how you see them, and I don't think it's necessarily how my parents should have seen me. This is our Korean daughter, that would have been awkward. But yeah, trying to make my racial reality even visible to them, it was just sort of something we worked on really over the whole course of our relationship.
I do want to come back to that question of, your Korean American identity, but just in general, I know you've talked to a lot of adoptive parents and adoptees lately. Do you think that attitude, because as you mentioned, your parents were not the only one, and they're almost told that this is how you should raise your child, in a sense. Do you think that's changing these days? Are there different attitudes towards transracial adoptions?
Oh, for sure. Things have shifted. Things are always evolving. One thing you see a lot more of these days, especially, is incorporating an adopted child's birth heritage or culture into the adoptive families. So, I mean, you'll hear a lot more about everything from adoptee culture camps, where kids can go and experience different elements of their heritage, in a group of fellow adoptees, to, families learning to cook together, taking language classes, going on homeland tours. a little bit of this was starting at the time I was a kid, but not nearly to the extent that it exists today. And I think honestly, a big reason for the growth and awareness, if there has been movement, it's partly the internet. People can actually connect and talk about these things more. And it is the result too of generations of adoptees well before me, really trying to talk about their truths and make these things, like make the implicit explicit in adoption and tell the truth about race in adoption. So I think you see a lot more celebration of heritage and culture. I think what's still hard for a lot of families, which isn't to say it's not happening, is like for white parents to talk to their children of color, like about racism, about privilege. Those are like it's not as fun as cultural exploration. Obviously, it's hard. It can be really uncomfortable. It requires that they do a whole lot of work on themselves first and a whole lot of education before they can really have those meaningful conversations with their kids. So I don't want to say I don't think that's ever happening. I'm sure, and I know for a fact it is in many families, but I think it's hard. And we know from studies that a lot of white parents don't talk with their kids about racism in the same way, maybe, that families of color do because we have to. So I do think attitudes are shifting and changing. And a lot of that has to do with just the work adoptees have done over many, many years before my book. But it's definitely like a work in progress.
And probably it will always be a work in progress. But so do you identify yourself as Korean American? And if you do, when did you start sort of think of yourself as Korean American? And what does that mean to you, other than that you're biologically Korean?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do think of myself as Korean. Even when I was little and experiencing like racism and like slurs at school and wanted to be white to blend in, I had never thought of myself as white. Like I very much always knew I was Korean. And over the years, thankfully, like before childhood was over, it was something I was able to really, I don't know how well I understood it, but I was proud of it. If you can be proud of something, proud to be something you have not been brought up in and don't know if you will ever fully understand. I don't know. Like, and I got to a point where I was also just like trying to figure out like who I was as an adopted Korean and realizing my Korean identity was never going to be the same as say it would have been if I had remained in my birth family. I'd obviously have a very different relationship to my Koreanness and to that family if we hadn't been separated for all those years. But I derive a lot of comfort from knowing that first of all, there are so many Korean adoptees, like we are legion. And so I have company, like I have community. And I definitely feel as though being a Korean adoptee is just being still part of that diaspora and just like a very different maybe type of community. And I don't have to choose between my adopted and my Korean identity. Like I am a Korean adoptee. For me, those things are inseparable. And so a lot of growing up into like my Korean identity, just for me personally, has been growing into my identity as an adoptee, realizing what that means for me, because it's not the same for everyone, of course. And that's honestly been like probably one of the most helpful things in helping me figure out like who I am as a Korean American. But yes, absolutely. I always, felt and knew I was Korean.
And also you claimed your last name, Chung. And if you read Nicole's book, if I hope everybody had, you find out that there was a birth certificate when you were born and you were given a Korean name. And then your adoptive parents chose the name Nicole. And I'm assuming that Chung is not the last name you grew up with. So at one point, why did you decide to claim that last name and what did that mean to you?
Yeah, it took years. First of all, I was in my late 20s, like searching for my birth family at the same time I was pregnant. So my family was growing in like a number of ways. And I was like in my late 20s before I even learned what my birth name had been. So it was just such a powerful moment of like holding this original birth certificate from this hospital in Seattle and seeing my name. And I didn't like leap to go by Chung to reclaim that, for right away. It took years. At first it was like thinking about a stranger's name. I was like, I don't know what my connection to this was. It took me a long time to really like for the fact to sink in that this was it was my original name. And then it was sort of covered up. And then I had to go through all these elaborate steps to get it back. So it was actually several years after I reconnected with and met my members of my birth family. And I really very much wanted a tie to my Korean heritage. So for me, taking the name Chung was actually, it was not about trying to claim this place in my birth family, which I was and still am a little unsure of my place in. Although I did ask my birth father's permission. I wanted to be sure it was okay with him. For me, it was very much about like having a name that finally, like after a lifetime, like linked me to my heritage, like to who I was before adoption came in and changed everything. And it was very much maybe a little bit about expressing kind of that pride in being Korean and being who I was and feeling like, okay, like I'm finally ready to have this important link to it. I don't know, names are so complicated, like for everyone, especially for adoptees, but I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to even learn my birth name. So many adoptees are curious and like it is much, much harder for them to get information. So I know it's a privilege that I was even able to at all.
Yeah. So then you decide to write a memoir. I know you've been wanting to become a writer and you studied writing and did all the workshops and all that. Did you always intend to write a memoir? And was that always going to be your first book? Or?
You know, it's funny. I was interviewing a friend about her book just last night. It was a memoir. And we were talking about how for so many memoirists, you sort of accidentally end up writing a memoir. Like it's like very rarely when you're growing up, you know, I have a daughter who wants to be a writer and she's never like, oh mom, like I really want to write a memoir, even though like I've written one. I don't think it's the form that immediately occurs to you. Growing up, I wrote mostly fiction and terrible, terrible poetry. And so it didn't occur to me that I would write nonfiction at all. I came to it kind of late in my 20s. And actually around the time I was searching for my birth family, without knowing I was going to one day write about that, I started writing little bits and pieces of personal stories, just like for fun. I was in a writing group. Everybody else was writing memoir for some reason. So I felt like some pressure to try it. And I really enjoyed it. And so, no, I didn't always intend to write a memoir, but once I did start writing personal stories, and once I started publishing them, I think that was kind of the turning point, and getting feedback and getting questions and having people ask me things about adoption or this like adoptee perspective that they mostly hadn't heard. I realized, you know, after writing a bunch of shorter pieces that it was hard to tell the story like bit by bit, piece by piece, and actually a full-length book would probably give me like the space I needed to do justice to the whole story and to all the people involved and to just all the nuances and complications of adoption. So that was when I started to think, okay, like maybe this is a book, maybe it's a memoir. But no, I mean, it was certainly not something I always planned. It was something I kind of, after many years of loving writing, fell into. So yeah.
But at the same time, your life is not just about you. So obviously it's about your parents, both birth parents and your adoptive parents, you know, your family. You know, there are a lot of, your book is structured in a way that there's actually a parallel story of your birth sister, whom you later found, and it's almost like a thriller, like how are they going to meet at the end? So what were your consideration when you are writing your memoir? What do you include and what you not include? Because as much as you want to tell your story in its full facets, all the different facets of it, it also touches on other people's privacy as well. And there are some, you know, really painful stories that you had to go into, or some of them you leave behind. So how did you decide what to leave in and what to leave out?
Yeah, so with myself, like with the parts that were just about me, it was just solely a matter of what I felt was important to the story. When you write a memoir, usually it can't be like your whole life story. And as my mother told me when I sold the book, like, you're not famous. Nobody is going to buy your life story. And it's true, like brutal, but true. So I always knew I was writing this memoir, it was going to be very focused on adoption. And I would like sometimes like sit there sifting through memories and sort of hold them up in my mind and think like, this was an important formative moment to me. Yes. Is it relevant to like my adoption journey, identity, story? Not really. And then I would be like, okay, that's for another thing. That's for an essay. That's for a different book, but it's not for this one. Reason being, like, if you just like put everything in there, it's like too many ornaments on a Christmas tree. It really helped me a lot that this was so focused on adoption, because it helped me make those really hard decisions about the different memories. When it came to other people's stories or places where our stories, I guess, overlapped, usually I would just say, I'm thinking about writing about this. And it was like not quite asking permission, but it was very much like, I want you to not be surprised. I'm going to share this with you. I want your feedback, your questions, your concerns. To my sister, because her story was so integral to it and so important to the book. And also, there are some really painful, traumatic parts. I did give her like full veto power. So anything my sister had wanted taken out, I absolutely would have. With everybody else, I think it would have been like, not necessarily no, but it would have been like a conversation. And no one else, including my sister, nobody actually asked me to take anything out. I was really prepared to have like conversations. But everyone was just, they were very supportive of the book itself, but also of like the work I had put in. I was, of course, like most worried about my adoptive parents, just not wanting to hurt them and wanting them to feel as though, yes, there are like real issues that are hard for us to talk about that came up, but my rule with writing memoir is like no surprises. So it wasn't like my parents were reading about these things for the first time. It wasn't like they were reading about things we had never talked about. We didn't necessarily talk about racism when I was a kid. We did not know how to have those conversations. We didn't know how to talk about like my Korean identity or what I felt was missing, but we did have those conversations when I became an adult, thankfully. And it was partly because of my search and my reunion that we had to have those conversations. So by the time I was writing the book years after that, it wasn't as though this was new to them. Whereas I think like if I were writing it and they had never seen this, it would have just been like shocking and much harder. So that was like, those are just some of my ground rules, like no surprises. Nobody should be like shocked to see like something about them in a book. And then just having really frank, honest conversations, letting them read it and talk to me about it well in advance of publication, in case there were things we had to go over or things they wanted me to take out. So yeah, those are just some rules, but it changes. And I think it's different for everyone. I know memoirists who would never even consider letting anybody in their family like read it beforehand or offer input, or like certainly not give anybody veto power. So it is like that was individual to me and to this book. But it was something I felt was important just for my sake and the sake of these relationships.
Not only you worked as a writer, but you also worked as editor for Catapult magazine. And I was just wondering, as an editor, what do you look for in the stories? What makes you go like, okay, that's the story I want to publish? What makes you like sort of get drawn into a story?
I'm so glad you asked me this, because I love talking about editing and I love working with other writers. So voice is really what it comes down to so often, the writer's voice. The voice as a writer is kind of like who they are. It's like their identity as a writer. And it's someone's voice that you're going to remember long after you might have forgotten details about the actual story. It's their voice that's going to make you recognize them later and go back and read other things they write. I think we all have those writers where like, no matter what they write, doesn't matter what it is, like, race or travel or frozen yogurt, like we're there, we're going to read it, whatever it is, because like we're fans of them, we're fans of their voice. So that's what I look for, and that tends to be what draws me in. I am also looking for kind of like a storyline that makes sense to me that I can follow. It's really important, particularly because of Catapult's focus on like narrative storytelling. But that said, there's a lot of wiggle room and room to play there. There's a lot of like experimental fiction and nonfiction. We also publish poetry. So it's not like I'm looking for like a rigid story form, but I am looking for like ultimately Like, is there a story I can follow? Is it a voice I want to spend more time with? And is there something for the reader, like, to hold on to? Because a piece of personal writing can't just be for you. You know, it needs to be for readers too. In a sense, like, they're even more important, because if you wanted to just write something for yourself or for catharsis, you'd write in a journal. And journal writing has tons and tons of benefits. It has great value. If you're going to put a piece of writing out into the world to be read, you have to be thinking about the people who will read it as well. It doesn't mean catering totally to people other than yourself, you know. And like writers of color, we talk a lot about how we don't want to write toward the white gaze, but still there has to be something for like a general reader to like grab onto, like I don't know, something that's for them. Because when you write something and it's out there, it has a life of its own. Every reader needs to have their own connection and relationship to it.
So we're gonna go to the questions from the viewers, and I think the first person would like to, is it Emmy Young?
So I read your book several years ago, and I was really floored by like how much I related to it. I never really, like, you had a talk about like adoption and interracial issues with my parents. So it was like, wow. And so like going off of what you mentioned earlier about like white parents and colorblindness, I was wondering like how you deal with racism. Like you said, it's hard for parents who don't really have the same experience as you, like racially. Because like for me, I've had numerous encounters where someone's like, where are you really from? And like, I'll say America, and they'll be like, no, that's not, that can't be right.
Yeah, sorry, just to make sure, are you asking how I deal with those encounters generally, or how I talk to like my white family about them? Just making sure
Like
I
how you
understand.
deal with like the encounters yourself.
Oh God. I mean, it varies so much. Usually I like stew and I'm furious and my face gets very hot. And I think about like the perfect rebuttal, like 2 hours later is pretty much how that works. I generally try to say something in the moment. So like if I got a where are you from? My quickest way usually is just to say like, I might say I'm from Oregon. And as you know, some people accept that and some people don't. But I don't know, like I tend to just like not want to give them the answers they're looking for. I've gotten slightly better about telling people when I think something is out of line. I mean, it's hard. I think especially growing up adopted, it's like I was used to making these explanations all the time because I would get asked these questions all the time because people would see me with my white family and feel like entitled to ask. So learning that I don't always have to answer, that I don't always have to educate, that not everybody deserves a response has been like the work of a lifetime for me. I wish I could say it gets easier, I wish I could say I was always great at thinking of like a snappy answer. But I'm not. It definitely, sometimes I just stammer. Sometimes I do think of a good thing to say, but usually it's something I'm processing later. I think your support system is really important. I have like several go-to group chats that I could immediately start talking to about such an encounter. And of course, there's people in my family, in my life that I would talk to. So basically jerks are never going to go away. But I think, as you become more sure in like who you are, you know that you can answer on your own terms and find support when and where you need it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're gonna go to Tae Kang next.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question is, what was your experience with the publishing industry, which is overwhelmingly white, as a first-time novelist?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I had a really good experience. So my publisher, it was an independent publisher, Catapult, actually. They bought my book before I went to work there, and then it was just sort of awkward sometimes at staff meetings. But everyone there was just so on board and excited. And I think at times even had more faith in it than I did. For a long time, I was thinking of this as like this quiet little book that like, maybe people who knew me would read. It didn't ever actually occur to me that it would have the kind of reach that it's had. And I feel really lucky. But yeah, my publisher was just fully supportive. I don't know if you have like any more like super specific questions about like the publishing experience, but like mine was very positive. That said, it is like an overwhelmingly white industry. And so like, I think there are times when you wind up maybe having to explain a bit more, like take the extra time to do that. And certainly the process of selling the book was not always easy. And I remember there were just a couple of conversations that I had at times with other publishers where I think one of them one time asked me, like, did I think anyone would read it if they weren't Korean or adopted? And I was like, well, part of me wanted to say there are a lot of Koreans and adoptees out there. That's actually a very big market. But yes, I think people read outside their experience all the time. I think it's why we read. So yeah, there have been certainly like some not great moments in publishing, but overall, like my actual publication experience with this book was overwhelmingly positive.
Well,
Great. Thank you.
that's good to hear. I believe Nora has her hand raised. Hi.
Hi,
Hey,
Nora.
thank you. Hey, often when I'm trying to write or journal or anything like that about my adoption, I find myself sometimes like not wanting to because I know that afterwards I'm just gonna go like really horrible and I don't know where to put that. So I'm just curious, Nicole, like how do you, as you're writing or after you're done writing, like how do you care for yourself as you're writing about your personal experiences?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, thank you for that. And I remember it used to be a lot harder than it is now, which is not to say I find writing about adoption easy, but I remember when I first started, there were these essays I wrote that I have still never shown anyone. Like they were for that writing group I mentioned before. I was brand new to writing about adoption and like every draft just hurt. It felt like I was scraping deep down under like something every time. It was just really, really tough. And I kind of tried to listen to that instinct, honestly. Like I wanted to get at the truth. I wanted to have this essay where I actually told the truth about adoption, which I had not done in writing before. But then I didn't really want to rush to show it to anybody. So I'm not telling you to put it in a drawer and save it for 10 years or anything like that. I'm just saying for me, I was able to write it because I knew I wasn't going to put it all out there and invite like public comment right away. I wasn't ready to do that. If I can be really frank, I took some years, I took some time. I had a support system. I also had a good therapist. And there were like a lot of things that I had to work through before I could not just even write this book, but like even begin to publish publicly about adoption. I still get some messages from like people. And some of these messages would have destroyed me if I had read them 10 years ago. I think I'm in a place now where I'm able to like read, trash, block, and like process and like go to my support system. I still go to therapy. I know where to go for the support I need, but it kind of rolls off my back now and it wouldn't have 10 years ago. So I don't want to tell you, I never want to tell anyone, don't tell your story because you've obviously got things you want to say that are important to you to say. But I will say gently, if I can, you don't have to rush to publish or show it to someone. It can be just for you for now. And just make sure you have the other supports in your life like lined up. Make sure you know who you're going to go to, or even pick first readers that you absolutely trust to get it, who will get what you're saying and not make that a hard experience sharing it. And I think you might know when you're actually ready to share it. I will say that adds a whole new complicating layer to writing about adoption, which I'm sure you know. So just, I don't know. And it's okay to take breaks. Oh my gosh, I've met people in like adoption land, like the adoption community. Some of them I've known for like 20 years almost. And we all kind of step back sometimes. There are lots of times I write about other things that have nothing to do with it. There are lots of times when I've had friends who've taken a step back for years from adoption work or writing, and that is okay too. Having other things in your life and other creative outlets that you enjoy and other things you like to write about. I think that'll help too. Just make it feel like, oh yeah, I can take breaks.
So speaking of being supportive, you write an advice column for Slate. And just this week, I'm reading off of your Instagram post. Just this week, you gave an advice for an open adoption in which communication with the birth mother has lapsed, being guilted into talking to toxic relatives, married people, and other people's secrets, and someone who wants to punish their 13-year-old for rudeness by making him live in a tent in the backyard.
Yeah, that was a new one.
So, and you do this weekly, literally.
Yeah.
How did you become an advice writer, column writer? Mm-hmm. And how do you approach writing an advice column?
Oh, yeah. So the advice column is fairly new. I started doing it, I believe, in November. Maybe my first column was the day after the election, a very good chill day to have, a new venture. But it's interesting. And how I became one, I mean, Slate reached out. They actually asked me a couple of years ago if I was interested. And I wrote a little memo, which they liked, but they gave the parenting advice columnist job to someone else. Totally fine. It happens all the time. They came back to me last year because they had an opening and remembered my memo. And so I didn't have to do anything this time. This time they just offered it to me. It was nice. So I write it weekly. And it's really it's been educational. So, I mean, the emotional labor of writing is like one thing, but then like sort of trying to read other people's problems or deep questions, or in the case of some of the questions, just like awful parenting mistakes. Like I don't like to judge, but like making your 13-year-old live in a tent in your backyard and use a bucket toilet, come on now. So there are definitely things that cross the line into judgment territory. It's a lot of like emotional labor. It's not uncompensated labor. And I enjoy the column a lot, but it's so interesting. It's a very voicey type of assignment where I feel like I can really lean into how I talk, like how I actually speak to people. The advice column is maybe the closest to my speaking voice out of anything that I write. And at the same time, it is not personal. I've gotten personal once or twice talking about anti-Asian racism, talking about how I have a child with autism. But like for the most part, it's not personal at all. So that's kind of a nice break for me too. And how I approach it is, it's so hard because it feels like very weighty and I want to do a good job for people. I mean, I've sometimes been unable to sleep because I'm like, oh, like I should have told this person this instead. And like, just like it feels like such a responsibility. What I try to remind myself is that I am really just trying to, give them another perspective, and I'm doing the best I can. I'm not a professional, but I can like read and think and care and approach it thoughtfully. And sometimes all we need is that like one other perspective. So many times in my life, all I have needed is not a professional, but just like one other perspective. So that's my approach. That's kind of what I'm trying to give. And it's fun. It's fun so far.
You talked about your chat groups, your support groups,
Mhm.
your therapist, all these things. Where do you get that one other voice when you
Oh,
need it?
so many different places. I mean, my husband is one, obviously. Sometimes it's one of my kids. Kids can really say things that cut through all the other stuff, and really get straight to the point. Sometimes it's a really good friend. So yeah, I've got like 4 or 5 different like chat groups, one of them with 2 fellow Korean American writers. And like, it just depends like kind of what the issue is or like who I haven't bothered that day already. But yeah, that tends to be where I find those extra perspectives that I need.
Right. And I think we have a question from Kathy Kim.
Hey,
Hi, Kathy.
thanks for speaking about your book, Nicole. I'm definitely going to read it. But my question is, do you have any advice for writers with writer's block? I came from a journalism background, did news writing and all that, and then social media, PR, and now I'm just doing event work. So I miss writing, and I was just telling my therapist, like, I feel like I need to write more about like mental health and Korean community and things like that. If you had any advice for that.
I do. I mean, and I think it's hard too when the block is coming from like writing about a topic that's like really hard to write about. But I will say for me, like just writing in general, my general writer's block troubleshooting is reading other books. I read a lot of poetry. Poetry is great. And like, it is perfect for the pandemic attention span as well. It's just like very short. You can read a poetry collection in half an hour if you want. And there will always be in every collection at least one, usually more, like there will be at least one perfect poem that is like just what you need to hear in that moment. I firmly believe this. I read essay collections, and one of my favorite, sometimes they're about craft or writing, sometimes they're not. One of my favorites is Alexander Chee's How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. I have read, like, I've picked a chapter of that book over and over to kind of shake me out of writer's block. And then I'm very fortunate in a way because I work with other writers as an editor day in and day out. And so all day I'm reading the work of other writers, and I can remind myself that revision works, even if, and I think sometimes that's the source of writer's block, is not knowing where the next piece will come from, where the next story will come from, or whether you can really like stick it. One thing being an editor has taught me is to have a great deal of faith in the writing and the revision process. So when I'm staring at a blank screen and it's terrifying, I can remember it doesn't have to come out perfect. Even after 10 edits, it doesn't have to be perfect, but like, well, and it will actually probably never be perfect, but it's going to get closer to like the true essence of what I need it to be. So like a lot of different approaches there, but the number one thing is reading whatever makes you feel inspired, whether it's nonfiction or fiction or poetry, just something that'll help shake you loose. I feel like nothing inspires you more than like other writers.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
I think there's some comments about the Time magazine article you wrote about talking to your parents about your adoptive parents about race issues, especially during the time when we saw such an increase against of hate crimes against Asian Americans. Can you just briefly tell us about what made you write that article?
I mean, there were a few different things. My adoptive parents have both passed away, and it was pretty recent for both of them. And with all of the attacks in the news, I started wondering, like a lot of my friends, my Asian American friends, were sharing stories about checking in on their parents or having their parents check in on them. And I found that so moving and also very heartbreaking. And of course, it got me thinking about like my parents and like, no, they weren't Asian. We didn't share that. And I was wondering a few things, like, would they have noticed all of this? Like, would that news have filtered through? Would they have connected it to me? Because again, they really did kind of struggle sometimes to think of me as like Asian American, despite the obvious. And I think I was also wondering, like, what would we have been able to talk? Would I have been able to help them understand, like, why I was angry, why I was sad, why this was such a struggle. So that piece was sort of written in exploration of that. And I also just felt like maybe there was a perspective, like, because there are so many Asian adoptees in this country, maybe that was a perspective that was worth exploring a little bit, not to try to speak for all of us, of course, just like one perspective. And so that's where that piece came from. I was a little bit surprised to have written it because I hadn't intended to. By the way, that is how a lot of essays come about. I have a new essay in Time tomorrow that I'm also surprised to have written. But yeah, that piece was very much like, it was like missing my parents, and it was thinking about them, and it was wondering, given that this was a lifelong, maybe struggles overstating, but a lifelong, like, tough conversation for us to have, how much would I have been able to make them understand? Because I think it's natural to want to be seen and like understood by family. So yeah.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions.
Okay.
Young Kim has a question.
Hi, how's it going?
Hi.
How are you?
Good. First of all, thank you for taking the time to share your insight on we have different topics and everything. But my question was, because of like the heavy memories that are involved in personal experiences, obviously it's kind of a daunting task to write. And I kind of want to know, what was your writing routine like, and how did you take your book to the finish line? And then about how long did it take you to actually complete the book from start to finish?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously it varies for everybody. Like, I know people who've spent a decade on books, and I sometimes think like maybe the book would be better if I had spent a decade on it. But it probably took about a year and a half from start to finish. And that's including a couple of months where we were mostly just revising. So like it probably took about a year to get a solid draft. And that is actually pretty quick. It's not long. It's not like War and Peace, but like it is. I was kind of surprised the draft happened as fast as it did, and then revision took longer. I think it's partly that my job at the time was less demanding. Like I was able to carve out more time, I was able to kind of work things and have a slightly more flexible schedule than I can now. Like I'm really struggling to write another book, and part of it's the pandemic and my children and virtual school and everything. So to answer your question about writing routine, it's like really hard. I feel like it was hard before the pandemic, and ever since it's been like impossible. I've always worked a full-time job while I've been a writer, so I've always crammed writing in the margins. So my routine, it might be I'm starting work late today, I'm going to write in the morning, and then I'm going to work my day job 12 to 8. It might be I'm going to work feverishly all day, and then at like 5 p.m. I'm going to start writing. I remember whole weekends where like my children probably didn't really see me. Like my husband would take them out of the house and they'd come back and I would have like written 5,000 words or something. So a lot of it was evenings and weekends. I hesitate to call it a routine. It's not like something I can really recommend, but I will say one thing, being really busy with both work and kids has given me as a writer is like, I can turn it on when I need to. I don't need special conditions to write. I don't need like a playlist or silence or even a private space. I think I wrote a lot of this book with my kids running around in the background. I am able to just sit down and write. And even if it's bad, I know I can go back and revise. I'm actually pretty good at just sitting down and hitting deadlines, but yeah, it's hard. It's always hard. Especially just this last year, it's been really, really difficult to find time, but I'm trying.
And that's the story I think we can all
right? Yeah.
relate to, right?
Yeah.
So the last question comes from Theon, who wants me to share her question with you, which is, how do you stay honest when writing? Often I find myself beginning to write from a white gaze or what I feel someone else will think of my experience rather than what I actually felt and experienced. So how do you stay sort of focused on your voice, I guess?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think I wouldn't say it's like I've achieved it. I think like there are days when I can really do it and I'm locked in and like it's my voice and I'm kind of unfiltered and maybe the writing's also good. And then there are days where that's a lot harder and I'll find myself still maybe pulling back or offering a disclaimer or an explanation or just circling because I'm not quite sure how to say what I want to say or what I feel. So just know it's like never a precise science, it is an art. And even without the white gaze, and I'm not discounting how that can interfere, it can still just be so hard to express what you really want to express. That's why when you do, it feels so good. That's why we keep writing. So in terms of how I stay honest, really like trying to think a lot before I write. And like, if it's not coming, if I'm not getting there, knowing when to step away and take a walk or talk to a friend who can help me talk through it. Or, I don't know. Sometimes I've let a piece of writing sit for days and then gone back to it just because I can tell like I need a little bit of more space to think about it. So, and I'm one of those writers who believes everything's writing, like thinking is writing, cooking can be writing. I get a lot of ideas in the shower. Like I get a lot of ideas when I walk. So there's a lot of different ways that you can still be working on your writing, even if you're not actually sitting there tapping on the keyboard. So knowing when to like plug in and plug out, I think part of it too is like revision, honestly. Like hopefully every draft that you do gets closer and closer to this honesty, like closer and closer to what you really want to say without censoring yourself. It's okay if it doesn't come out that way the first time. That's partly why we revise. I don't know. And then like just getting feedback from other people, just like straight up asking, does this make sense? Do you feel like I'm like throat clearing here? Or is this really coming across? So second opinions, other readers that you trust, editors, these are all like really helpful. And then again, like not to sound like a broken record with the reading thing, but like looking back at readers you really admire who have just like managed to say the thing, like you can tell they are like locked in and they said the thing they were trying to say. Look at the like techniques that they use and think about why it works. The more time you spend reading and sort of analyzing how other writers do what they do, I think the easier it is to kind of sink into your own voice and figure out like what kind of writer you want to be, and then get closer and closer to that.
Thank you, Nicole. So I'm going to ask you one more favor.
Okay.
We're going to give away your book. Nicole has generously donated 2 copies of her book, signed by her. So pick a number between 1 to 21 for me.
17.
Okay. So whoever is the 17, that's going to let me know. And then we're going to also pick one person from the wait list. So pick a number between 1 and 14?
8.
8. Okay, so the winners are Jenny, Mayo, and whoever was on the wait list. So congratulations to all the winners. Please stay on this call, Jenny, so that we can get your information where we can send you the book. And of course, our biggest thanks to Nicole for donating your book, but of course, sharing your stories. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for attending this edition of Writer's Block. This event was sold out in record time, as usual. So we wish we could have accommodated more people. Korean American Story will broadcast this program on a later date so that you can watch it again and let other people know about it. And the next edition of Writer's Block is scheduled for July 21st with Alexander Chi. So make sure you follow Korean American Story on Instagram, Facebook, or sign up for emails so that you don't miss any of the upcoming events. Korean American Story is a nonprofit organization, as I mentioned before, which means we are counting on your financial support. And you can join the Storyteller Circle by becoming a monthly donor. Just $10 a month enables us to launch new programs like the Writer's Block. $25 a month supports the complete production of one K-Pod episode. If you haven't checked it out, please check it out. This month, our board member, Karen Kim, is offering to double your donation. Your $10 a month donation can become $20 a month if you join now. The end of the month is just around the corner, so I hope you will take advantage of this very generous offer. You can text Storytellers to 44321 or visit our website, koreanamericanstory.org. You'll also have the option to make a one-time donation or find out many other ways you can get involved. And once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicole. We cannot wait to read more from you. I know you have a book coming up pretty soon. We wish you all the best. And thanks to the staff members of the Korean American Story for making this event happen. And happy reading, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.